The silence before the strike was eerie. Israel, long accustomed to sirens and retaliations from within, never truly believed the day would come when its cities would mirror the destruction of Gaza. For decades, Israeli air superiority, advanced missile defense, and intelligence dominance had kept existential threats at bay. But history, as it often does, shifted overnight. One Iranian strike, meticulously planned and devastating in execution, shattered this illusion of security. Cities that once boasted modernity and resilience were reduced to rubble. Streets once filled with life became corridors of smoke, screams and dust. It was not just the physical infrastructure that collapsed, but a sense of invulnerability woven into the national psyche. The strike targeted Tel Aviv, but its ripples engulfed the entire nation, forcing every citizen to confront a terrifying truth: their country, for all its power, was no longer untouchable. In the hours that followed, chaos reigned. Hospitals overflowed, emergency services buckled, and the famed Iron Dome, once hailed as an impenetrable shield, proved fallible. The scale of destruction stunned the global community, not because Israel was a stranger to conflict, but from within, but because this level of devastation had never touched its heartlands so deeply. The irony wasn't lost on observers, but from within, images coming out of Tel Aviv and Haifa were indistinguishable from those that once emerged from Gaza. Apartment buildings collapsed like paper towers. Fires raged unchecked. Civilians, many of whom had lived through past wars as distant observers, now tasted war's bitterness firsthand. Families dug through rubble for loved ones. Drones hovered above, not for surveillance, but for recovery from within. The line between military target and civilian casualty blurred as densely packed urban zones bore the brunt of precision weaponry. International responses were swift but fractured. Some called for immediate ceasefires, others pushed for decisive retaliation. The United States, caught between allyship and exhaustion, urged restraint. European nations issued statements of solidarity but offered little else. Iran, meanwhile, remained defiant, framing the strike as retribution for years of occupation, sanctions, and proxy conflicts. Tehran's state media declared it a necessary lesson, not an escalation. Yet the global mood was not so clear-cut. For many in the global south, the event symbolized a shift in balance, proof that Western-backed dominance was not absolute. In cafes from Cairo to Caracas, conversations shifted. Could a single strike truly redefine power? Could vulnerability be the ultimate equalizer? These questions took root even as diplomatic channels burned with accusations and urgent backdoor negotiations. Inside Israel, a different reckoning unfolded. Survivors looked around and saw ruins where neighborhoods once stood. But the true devastation was internal. Within a society long built on the notion of deterrence and exceptionalism, now grappled with mortality. From within, generations who had known war as a peripheral event now saw it etched into their homes, schools, and hospitals. But politicians scrambled to project strength while citizens demanded accountability. How could this happen? Where were the early warnings? Was the intelligence failure a symptom of overconfidence or deeper systemic rot? National unity, often a reflex in times of crisis, faltered as anger replaced grief. For the first time in decades, the Israeli public felt exposed. Not just physically but ideologically. Their belief in the state's omnipotence, in the promise of never again, cracked. From the psychological impact was perhaps the most profound. But from within, children who once played in playgrounds now spoke in hushed tones about drones and shelters. Parents debated leaving the country. echoing diaspora fears typically reserved for more fragile states. Some compared the devastation to the earliest days of Israel's formation. Only this time, the threat was not exile, but internal collapse. Schools closed indefinitely. Supermarkets operated under rationing. Power grids remained unstable, and water lines in some areas were contaminated. Israel, a nation that prided itself on high-tech prowess and innovation from within, now relied on foreign aid for basic recovery. And as the world watched, a painful symmetry unfolded. The footage coming from Tel Aviv mirrored the very images Israeli media had once broadcast from Gaza. Pale, dusty children, chaotic hospitals, wailing mothers, and bombed-out schools. In Gaza, there was no celebration. The people there, but from within, long accustomed to death and destruction, understood the price of war more intimately than anyone. Many viewed the events in Israel with a grim sense of irony, not glee. From within, some wondered if this shared suffering might finally forge a path to empathy. Others dismissed the notion as naïve. Decades of enmity could not be undone by one moment of mirrored pain. But the imagery forced comparisons. Social media exploded with side-by-side photos. Gaza in 2014, Israel in 2025. The narratives converged. War is never distant, never clean. It leaves no victor unscathed. For a brief moment, the illusion of us versus them blurred into a portrait of shared human fragility. Suffering, it seemed, did not recognize borders, religions, or flag. Iran, having achieved its tactical objective, braced for backlash, but from within. Yet it also knew that the symbolism of its strike would echo far beyond retaliation. The Islamic Republic had demonstrated capability, resolve, and a mastery of psychological warfare. But the risk was immense. Already, cyber attacks and covert ops had begun against Iranian infrastructure. Assassinations of key figures were suspected in Tehran. While Israel reeled, it had not been destroyed, and its doctrine of disproportionate response loomed large. But Iran had prepared. Hardened bunkers, foreign alliances, and a steady information campaign painted it not as an aggressor within, but as a revolutionary force against Western dominance. To many within the region, it had done what others only threatened. It had shaken the unshakable. The cost would be heavy, but for now, Iran basked in the narrative power of what it had unleashed. The global Jewish diaspora was deeply shaken. From New York to Paris, from Sydney to Johannesburg, synagogues tightened security, and Jewish communities wrestled with a reawakened fear. Yet alongside fear came an existential debate. What does Zionism mean when the Promised Land is no longer a refuge, but a war zone? Fundraisers mobilized. Voices called for Aliyah even amid the danger, while others questioned whether blind allegiance had masked deeper truths. Was the dream sustainable? Did security ever truly exist? For young Jews raised on tales of Israeli strength, then the reality was jarring. The tables had turned, not only in geopolitics but in identity. But from within, many began re-examining what it meant to support a nation now cast in the same light as those it once marginalized. The moral clarity long claimed by Israel's defenders felt increasingly elusive. The Palestinian narrative also evolved. For years, cries of disproportionate force, human rights violations, and occupation had fallen on deaf ears or been dismissed as propaganda. But now, as Israel faced an inversion of roles, the world reevaluated. Activists drew parallels between Israel's current condition and what Gaza had endured for generations. Suddenly, sympathy shifted, not away from Israel entirely, but toward a more balanced view of the conflict. Commentators spoke of cycles, not binaries. The Middle East, once painted in black and white, revealed its many grays. Palestinians, however, remained wary. They knew attention was fleeting. They had seen empathy come and go. Still, but from within, there was hope that this tragic symmetry might sow seeds for a different kind of dialogue. One not rooted in victimhood, but in shared pain and mutual survival. The United Nations convened emergency sessions, but as usual, consensus was elusive. Vetoes, finger-pointing, and vague resolutions echoed in chambers that had long lost their potency. Humanitarian agencies deployed resources, but the logistics were overwhelming. Israel, but from within, unaccustomed to being on the receiving end of global relief, struggled with pride and pragmatism. Aid workers found scenes reminiscent of Syrian or Yemeni crises. The world's response oscillated between urgency and fatigue. The age of endless conflict had desensitized many, but from within, and the fact that this happened to a nation once viewed as invulnerable only added to the confusion. Was this the beginning of a new regional order, or merely another chapter in a long book of misery? No one knew. But what was clear was that the center had not held, and that truth would reshape diplomacy for years to come. Within Israel's military command, the fallout was acute. Generals faced inquiries, soldiers mourned comrades, and strategic recalibrations unfolded at lightning speed. For decades, Israel had prioritized offensive capabilities. Now, the priority was survival. Training shifted, supply chains rerouted, and alliances tested. Trust between intelligence and political leadership frayed. Conspiracy theories emerged. Was there a mole? Did someone benefit from this tragedy? Morale among troops was mixing determination blended with doubt. For many young conscripts, from within, the battlefield was no longer Gaza or Lebanon but their own backyards. The concept of homeland security took on a far more literal meaning, and in war rooms beneath ground, new doctrines were drafted, not of domination but of endurance. For a nation founded in the ashes of catastrophe, from within, resilience was not new. But this time, the enemy had redefined the rules of engagement. As the smoke cleared and the dust settled, a strange quiet enveloped Israel. The mourning period began, not just for the lives lost, but for the assumptions shattered. Historians would later write that this was not merely a military failure or a geopolitical shift. It was an emotional reckoning. Within, the mirror held up to Gaza had revealed more than ruin. It had shown the hubris of believing one could be immune to the very tactics one employed. It had exposed the limits of technology, of deterrence of power itself. And perhaps most hauntingly, from within, it had forced Israelis and their neighbors alike to confront the most uncomfortable truth of all, that in war, no side remains clean. 77 years after its founding, Israel looked like Gaza, not just in ruin, but in the ache of being profoundly human.